Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tempo Afrique TV on the Somaliland USA program. Today we have a special coverage on a special case where we will cover the story of a heinous crime perpetrated by a colonel of the 5th Brigade of the former Somali Republic to an innocent civilian from Gabiley, Somaliland. I have Dr. Kathy Roberts on Skype, in which we will be interviewing her about the case between Mr. Warfah and Colonel Yusuf Tuke. Dr. Kathy, how are you?
Hi, I'm very well. Pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you please give us details about the case between Mr. Warfah and Colonel Yusuf Tuke?
Sure. Our case, CJA's case, was filed in 2004, and it took 15 years to get to trial in 2019. The allegations in the case are for torture and attempted extrajudicial killing, which is to say, would you like to know the facts of the case?
Thank you. Can you tell us about CJA quickly and what they do and their existence?
CJA is the Center for Justice and Accountability, and it's a nonprofit law firm that represents the victims of atrocity crimes in litigation, primarily in civil litigation in the United States, and of course, whenever possible, in criminal litigation, whether here or in other countries.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. If I may ask you about the court process of this case, I know it took over a little under a week, probably 3 days in courts and a few days in the jury deliberation process. Tell us about the court process and the jury process.
Sure. Yeah, so the Eastern District of Virginia, the federal court in Alexandria, where we tried this case, is also known as the Rocket Docket. So we tried a case that probably in another court would have taken 5 days, but in this court, where they run long hours and sort of shorten wherever possible, we were able to present the case and give it to the jury within 3 days. So that process in the United States in a civil case means we had to select a jury, a minimum of 6 people. In this case, there were 8 people on the jury. After selecting the jury, each side gives their opening statement. The plaintiff presents evidence and the defendant has an opportunity to present evidence. And then we have our closing arguments, and that goes to the jury for their deliberations. In this case, the jury deliberated for as much time as we took presenting evidence. So it was, on the one hand, a very simple case, and on the other hand, kind of a more complex case.
Thank you. And how many members were in the jury panel?
There were 8 members in the jury panel.
Yes. How many?
8.
8 members. Okay. Were there any African or
no
Somalis in the jury?
No, no, there were not. I think that it would be very unlikely that the judge would have allowed a Somali American to be in the jury. It's possible, but the court is going to check very carefully for any biases or prior knowledge. Right. And so what they really want, what any judge, not just this judge, any judge is going to want sort of a blank slate. So, if this case had been tried in Somalia or in Somaliland, obviously you would have a jury who knew something about the history. But since it's tried in the U.S., they were limited really to knowing the history that we could bring in the courtroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about the witnesses, especially for Mr. Warfah's witnesses.
Certainly. So
how did they present
first
the evidence?
I'm so sorry.
And if you can, name a few or touch 1 or 2 witnesses' story.
Certainly. So initially, we opened the case by presenting the testimony of Ambassador Robert Gazende, who was a U.S. ambassador, special envoy to Somalia. He was he called himself a Somali junkie. He lived in Mogadishu during, before the coup, during the coup, and after the coup, and he remain fascinated by the issues that happened in the history of that country right up to today. So he was a very, very knowledgeable expert and testified, among other things, about the government's plan to sort of unleash violence against civilians, particularly ISAC civilians, the economic reasons for that, and the sort of strategic reasons for that in terms of the location of the region vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. So it was a very, very interesting sort of historical testimony. And then, of course, our client testified, Mr Warfah testified as to how he was, arrested when he was 17 years old, sleeping in front of his parents' house. He was a sort of, I guess we've been referring to him as semi-nomadic. His family had a farm, so they were not nomadic at all, but because he was herding camels at that age, that meant he would travel with the camels a little bit. So, it was a sort of classic, traditional Somali home out in the countryside, and he was arrested along with 15 other men in his village. He was the youngest. The soldiers took them to the 5th Brigade base, military base headquarters. There he was tortured night after night after night and subjected to the MIG torture, among others, and finally shot at point blank range by the defendant in a rather careless manner, assumed to be dead, and miraculously survived when some of Colonel Ali or Colonel Tukey's soldiers took him to his family for a bribe. So he told that story in a great deal more detail. We also presented testimony from a couple of former soldiers who had served under Colonel Tukey's command, and they testified to the kind of abuses that he would tolerate in his command, and abuses of civilians. One of the witnesses there is Abdi Abdullahi. He was not a very high-level soldier at the time, but he was able to witness specifically the events relating to Mr. Warfah's detention. He didn't witness Mr. Warfah in particular, or if he did, he didn't know it at the time, but he was aware of this supposed missing water tanker and the colonel's orders to arrest everyone between the base and the border with Ethiopia, and the tortures that those civilians were subjected to, just for an example.
Thank you for describing the case and talking about the witnesses' testimony. It was definitely a heinous crime that was perpetrated by a colonel who had authority over civilians, where he abused his power over them. Dr. Roberts, I want to ask you about Mr. Warfah's case drew national attention and also international attention, where CNN ran a report and investigation, and also the Guardian newspaper in England also covered it in an article. What was unique about this case in particular?
Well, I think it's always a unique situation when you can see someone achieve justice from one of those parts of the world where no one expects you to achieve justice, right? That Farhan was able to, after 31 years, overcome language barriers, overcome legal barriers, overcome distance, to sort of make a connection with lawyers to be able to pursue this case and ultimately see justice in a courtroom in Virginia is truly remarkable whenever it happens. So I think that's probably the main reason why it has drawn attention. Now, on the other hand, I think in particular CNN has discovered and sort of doggedly pursued this particular perpetrator or defendant, because he keeps taking jobs where people's lives are in his hands, right? So if he's working security at Dulles Airport or he's driving Uber, I think that has a kind of sensationalist factor for the media. From my point of view, it doesn't show a great deal of common sense, but I don't begrudge him the ability to have a job so much as the ability to terrorize civilians. I think shouldn't be tolerated.
Okay, thank you. Can you quickly summarize who is Colonel Yusuf Tukey, who he was back in Africa, and what was his authority? What kind of role did he play as a commander?
Sure. So Colonel Yusuf Abdi Ali also goes by the nickname Chuke. So just to be clear, what's his name and what's his nickname? He was the commander. So at the time when my client was arrested, tortured, and shot, he was the commander of the 5th Brigade of the Somali National Army. That meant he had authority and control over all of the military in the Gabili area. So there was a specific area that I couldn't outline for you specifically right now, but he had control of that whole area. He had several battalions. He had thousands of soldiers answerable to him in that area. Shortly after that, after the attacks on Barre and Hargeisa, he testified that he became the 2nd Division commander. So he would have had control of that whole area surrounding Hargeisa and including Gabili.
Yeah, I saw a picture where he was laughing at a Burning Man where he burned him alive. Was that also part of the testimony or evidence, that picture?
Well,
that
yes and no. Yes and no. We did present testimony from Ahmed Amuse Madar, whose brother was burned alive and who blamed Chuke for that, and he presented that testimony. However, I don't know about that photograph. The photograph, I have seen it. I'm not confident that the way it's characterized is an accurate characterization of that photograph. So certainly the photo of Colonel Ali or Colonel Chuke, I think that's him, but whether that's actually a burning man or just an overexposed negative, I think it's not super obvious to me. So we didn't present that photograph for that, for any kind of evidence of burning.
Okay. I want to ask you about the Barre regime. What do you think of the Barre regime and the genocide they conducted in Somaliland by killing over 500,000 civilians in general?
I'm sorry,
what do you think?
I
just want to hear
didn't
your
hear
opinion.
you very well. You're asking me about whom?
The Barre regime,
Ah,
Siad Barre regime.
sure. So about the Barre regime and what was their...
About the Barre regime and the killings of the civilians in the Somaliland region.
Sure. Well, the Barre regime's stated goal, I think, was to repress, control, or eliminate members of the Isaaq clan in the Northwest region. They needed to get control of those kind of economic routes, those ports, and the Isaaq people were seen as being in the way. Isaaq people, of course, were not the only people targeted by that regime, as is well known. Even in CJA's cases, we've also represented others who were targeted in part for their clan background or for their presumed political beliefs. But certainly the Isaaq were singled out for particularly egregious punishment.
Thank you. Now I want to ask you about the case is concluded. The verdict was done this past Tuesday on May 21st, 2019. Mr. Warfah was awarded $500,000 US, and also on the other hand, the defendant, Mr. Colonel Yusuf Tuke, was found guilty on all charges. What's next for Mr. Warfah? Is he going to collect that money, or is it obviously the defendant was a Uber driver in the United States and probably won't have that much money in his accounts? What would be the outcome of that, the verdict?
Yeah, I think that it's obvious that Mr. Ali is unlikely to be able to pay that judgment in full. And I think that our client, Mr. Warfah, does not have any real expectation that he's going to collect all of that money. A lot of people would say this is the sort of case that should be tried in a criminal context. But since it can't be, in a civil context, the money damages is the language of punishment. And so, I think that judgment has a great deal of meaning for us and for Mr. Warfah, whether or not he ever sees a dime of it. And of course, we'll try to make sure that we can collect for him what we can.
And lastly, I want to ask you, CJA, or the Center for Justice and Accountability organization, was involved in two other cases at least from the Somalia and Somaliland countries. Can you quickly summarize what those cases were?
Sure.
Those two other cases.
Yeah. The first case was the Yusuf versus Samantar case. And General Samantar was, of course, the head of the armed forces throughout the Barre regime. He was also the sort of number 2 to the dictator on the Supreme Revolutionary Council, and he served as the prime minister. The Samantar case spanned a time period from 1982 until 1988, and really, started with the arrest of the UFO group and the reprisals after the student riots, and went all the way through to the sort of apex of violence in June 1988 with the bombing and strafing of civilians and disappearance of people as the soldiers went house to house pulling people out, never to be seen again. So we covered a lot of ground in the Samantar case, and that was a big case. That was decided in 2012, February 2012. That case also had gone to the Supreme Court on the issue of whether individuals could be protected from suit by the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, and the Supreme Court agreed with us 9-0 that General Samantar could not avail himself of that statute. Then the next case that went to trial was the Ahmed versus Megan case. Colonel Megan was in charge of the National Security Service, also sometimes called the Black SS. It was kind of the Somali government's version of the KGB, internal intelligence. He ran a number of torture and interrogations, including of our client, Professor Abukar Ahmed, who had been actually defending a number of people who were singled out for sort of false prosecution, many of whom were Isaac, many of whom were his students. He was a constitutional law professor, a Hawiya man. And so he'd actually already served 5 years in prison for this activism. And when he got out, he went right back to it, went right back to teaching the Constitution. And he knew very well the man who was in charge and heard, even though he was blindfolded, he heard the man give the order for his torture. So that case was also decided in 2012 in the Southern District of Ohio. So this case then was the last in the trilogy, and it took a little bit longer to get to trial, but covered this very specific area within sort of the same region. Both of those other cases in some sense would have fallen under General Samantar's responsibility in some sense, but I think that this particular defendant was responsible for such brutality and such violence that he was worthy of a separate case.
Thank you. There are plenty of Barre regime's former officials out there who committed similar crimes. Is CJA ready for another case?
I think that
if it
in
pops
general,
up,
the answer will be...
comes up?
Sorry?
There are plenty of, I was kind of asking you a follow-up question to that question. There are plenty of Siad Barre's regime officials or former officers out there elsewhere in the world. If another case arises that's similar to the cases you have conducted, is CJA ready to take on those cases?
I would say in general, yes, though I'm not in a position to speak for CJA on that point. But I think that the challenge is always to find a jurisdiction that would allow for prosecution or would allow for a civil case, because it isn't often the case for crimes that are this old.
Thank you. And finally, I want to ask you a personal question. Have you ever been to Somaliland?
Yes, several times.
You have?
Yes.
Okay. Which city or town have you been to?
I've been to Hargeisa, Berbera, Arabsio, Gabili, Jiboure, Ilkawene.
So you are all over.
Know, a few places.
That's good. At least you have, at least. That's good. Well, thank you very much for the interview. We do appreciate your work, and congratulations on winning the case. You and the CJA organization and Mr. Warfah himself, we want to congratulate you and the entire team. Tempo Afrique TV is here to congratulate you as well, and we appreciate your time and consideration today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks. Have a good evening.
Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, we're covering a special edition from the Somaliland USA program at Tempo Afrique TV, where we covered the story of a heinous crime perpetrated by a colonel of 5th Brigade of the former Somali Republic to innocent civilians in the city of Gabile, Somaliland, under his command in 1988 and 1999 during the Siad Barre regime. Colonel Tuke Yusuf Abdi tortured, shot at a close range Mr. Warfah multiple times before leaving him for dead and later survived. CJA, the Center for Justice and Accountability, an organization based in California, which identifies and prosecutes the world's worst human rights criminals, and Mr. Warfah took Yusuf Tuke to a trial court in Virginia last week, where Mr. Warfah was awarded $500,000 US dollars, and Colonel Tuke, or Colonel Yusuf Tuke, was found guilty of all charges. We interviewed Dr. Roberts, Kathy Roberts, a senior legal advisor from the CJA this afternoon to give us details about the case. Thank you very much. Until we meet again next week.